Hello, today we are interviewing Dr. Samuel Gregg. He is the Director of Research at Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We're talking about freedom and religion. Some people argue that a conscientious Christian must favor well-intentioned welfare programs or redistribution schemes, or even radical socialism. Is this true?
The short answer to that is no. There's no reason why Christians should necessarily favor radical restructuring of the economy in terms of more redistribution. There's no reason why Christians have to be in favor of socialism. There's no reason why Christians need to be in favor of even things like very high taxation. What matters for Christians when it comes to economic issues are, first of all, that economic life is promoting human flourishing, and secondly, that people are getting out of poverty. Christians have to be concerned about poverty. It's a non-negotiable dimension of our faith. But how we realize the goal of reducing poverty depends very much upon empirical judgments about what works, what gets people out of poverty, and what doesn't. Now, of course, there are other demands of justice, legal justice, distributive justice, commutative justice. But I think it's very important that when we talk about things like justice, that we go and make sure that we accompany that with an emphasis upon the principle of subsidiarity, which means that when we're working to deal with problems of poverty, we try to make sure that those dealing with the problems are those closest to the problem. Governments, bureaucracies are usually very bad at dealing with these problems. It's much better to have local communities, local groups, those who are closest to the problem trying to address them. Another thing that Christians bring to the table is that they understand that poverty is not just material. There's moral poverty and spiritual poverty, and that can have implications for material poverty. So one of the things that Christians bring to the whole discussion about poverty that's distinct is that they take the whole human person seriously, not just the material dimension, but also the moral and spiritual dimension as well.
There's a tendency to think that secular societies or societies governed by a secular mentality fare better or protect freedom better and also tend to poverty concerns in a better way than, say, societies where a large percentage of the people are religious. What you've just said sort of disproves that, but can you talk a little bit about secularism?
Well, a lot depends on which religion we're talking about, because I think there's often a tendency to conflate all religions as if all religions are the same. Well, Judaism is not the same as Christianity. Christianity is not the same as Islam. Islam is not the same as Buddhism. They're actually quite different in some very important ways. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is that when we talk about secularism, I always ask the question, are you talking about a healthy distinction between the spiritual realm and the temporal realm, or are you talking about secularism as an ideology that sees that treats religion as being basically superstition, that tries to drive religion out of the public square, that denigrates religion, that denigrates the right of religious freedom? If that's what you mean by secularism, and if that goes hand in hand with more or less social democratic policies, then I think we can point to plenty of examples where that doesn't work when it comes to economic development and reduction of poverty. So if you're saying to me that secularism is effectively more or less European social democracy, well, it will get you a certain way, but I think you end up with a lot of social costs. High welfare dependency, high taxation, rigid labor markets, and people who have no faith in the future. Because if you're a secularist in an ideological sense, and you say there's no God, there's no possibility of life after death, etc., then why would you care about the future? Hope in that context really can't mean very much. And that, I think, has significant political and economic implications for society.
There's also a view that religion causes war. This is something Richard Dawkins has said, and some people think that the violence in the world currently is produced by religious intolerance or religious disputes. Do you agree?
Well, there's no doubt, if you look at the historical record of all religions, more or less, you can find instances of religious intolerance, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, etc. The question you have to ask yourself, though, is first of all, which religions are we talking about? And in which religions are these forms of behavior essentially deviations, or whether they're actually core to what the actual religion believes? And I think if you look at different religions, I think you'll find very different answers to those questions. But when it comes to secular societies, if you look at radically atheist, materialistic societies and regimes, they have killed hundreds of millions of people, particularly in the 20th century. I'm thinking in particular of communist regimes, which by definition are atheist and materialistic, killed thousands and millions of people in a relatively short period of time. So if you want to do a body count of who is most responsible for death and intolerance and destruction of property and life, I think those who describe themselves as radical secularists, and communism is more or less a form of radical secularism, then I think you start to think very differently about this question.
Thank you. Why does economic freedom reinforce religious freedom and vice versa?
Well, there's three things that all authoritarian and totalitarian regimes try to destroy. One is private property, the second is religious freedom, and third is the family. If you look at the history of Marxist regimes, fascist regimes, they always try and damage these three things. Why? Because they know that these three things are integral to the autonomy of individuals and communities. If you can destroy economic freedom, then that means that churches, religious communities no longer have the resources that they need to support themselves, materially speaking. If you destroy religious liberty, you can destroy anything. Because if a government is capable of taking away people's religious freedom, which is the thing that people are most likely to fight for, there's really nothing else that will stand in their way. The other thing on a more positive level, I would say, is that more economically free societies, when coupled with religious liberty, I think lead to much more dynamic, freer, open, more creative societies, as opposed to societies in which economic freedom and religious freedom are compressed or basically marginalized out of existence. If you ask yourself which are societies that are more likely to be prosperous but also flourishing in that broader sense of the term, I think you'll find that they're characterized by high levels of economic freedom and high levels of religious freedom. Take away one, you do damage to the other.
That leads us to the last question, which would be, how much intellectual freedom do people who adhere to an organized religion have? For instance, as Catholics, how much intellectual freedom, how much can we say about earthly affairs, and how much do we have to adhere to a specific dogma?
Right. Well, again, that depends on which type of religion we're talking about. And different religions have different ways of approaching this issue of the legitimate autonomy of what's called in the Christian world, the legitimate autonomy of the laity, those of us who are not clergy, those of us who are not pastors, who are not priests. So, for example, in the Catholic Church, and I'm a Catholic, we obviously have to take the Church's teaching on what are called faith and morals very seriously. You can't be a Catholic and say the Pope is just an ordinary person. You can't say we can dispense with the hierarchy. You can't say the Eucharist is not the soul and divinity of Jesus Christ. But when it comes to things like the question of how we order the political order or how we organize an economy, the Church tends to outline general principles: solidarity, human dignity, subsidiarity, freedom, etc. But there's a lot of room for prudential judgment on the part of laity about how these principles are realized. It's entirely possible for Christians of good faith to come to quite different conclusions about those issues. But what's important is that lay Christians have the prime responsibility for thinking about and building free and just political, economic, and social orders. The role of the clergy, of pastors, of priests, is to form consciences, to remind us of the principles, to remind us when we go radically wrong in the way we apply these principles, but it's not their primary responsibility to get involved in the details of politics and economics. And I think good bishops, good priests, good pastors understand this distinction very well.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.